It's a pleasure to open this debate, Mr Deputy Speaker, which was prompted by a letter from an independent pharmacist in my constituency, Mr Tim Gibb, who runs the Yarmouth Pharmacy. For those people who know the Yarmouth Pharmacy, it is not very far from our beautiful harbour in Yarmouth and just opposite Yarmouth Castle. I'm delighted that my honourable friend is on the front bench, and I know she's a great supporter of pharmacies and pharmacists, and indeed independent pharmacists, and I'm aware that the honourable member for West Suffolk, Secretary of State for Health, has spoken at the National Pharmacists Association today, and I think has spoken very eloquently on the need of a major winter flu vaccination programme, which clearly we would welcome. I do want to cover some of the issues, and I won't speak for too long because I'm aware there are one or two other people who want to speak as well, and it is getting late in the day. I would like to cover some issues of concern, not only to pharmacists but also to independent pharmacists, who are especially important in isolated and rural communities, as other members here, including from places such as Cornwall, will testify. I have 6 independent pharmacists in my patch, and all are highly valued. We have Tim in Yarmouth, Freshwater, Seaview, Ryde and Regents, who cover both East Cowes and Shanklin, and I'm very grateful for Gary for taking the time to chat last week about some of the issues that faced him. Whilst many healthcare providers closed their doors during the COVID pandemic, pharmacists stayed open, often at risk for themselves and their staff, and for many people in our communities, NHS pharmacies were the visible face of healthcare on the high street. And it is to their great credit that they stayed open and continue to serve their patients, often delivering at their own cost to vulnerable and at-risk patients, to make sure that those people got the medicines they need, dropping them off at their homes. They have seen patients in person and ensured that the public, particularly vulnerable patients, had a consistent and safe supply of medicine, and in doing so, they took considerable pressure off other elements of the health service, GPs answering calls very much on the phone very often, and A&E and other NHS services. However, talking to Tim and Gary and other pharmacists in my patch, there is considerable financial insecurity on top of all the other problems that they have faced. And that is worse for pharmacists like Tim, who have to rely on over-the-counter trade. Now, clearly, in a place like Yarmouth, where you have a lot of yachts at weekends, he can make up the loss of income in other areas, or the decline of income in other areas, by selling sort of soaps and sort of, all the good things that chemists normally sell. But clearly, in the COVID period, those sales took a very, very significant hit, and that applied to all the independent pharmacists and indeed many of the chemists in my patch. They've incurred many thousands of pounds in additional monthly costs in order to stay open and serve the community, and some of my independent pharmacists were actually relying on volunteers as well. They paid for the cost of installing screens, buying PPE, although I think the Isle of Wight Council did help him out after he requested it on a couple of occasions, hiring locums, paying overtime, as well as the increased prices of medicines from wholesalers, which pharmacists are not allowed to pass on to customers. This has created serious cash flow problems. I'm very grateful, as we all are, for the government providing £300 million in emergency loans to the sector at the outset of this crisis, and an additional £70 million since. These are very significant sums of money. The loans, however, are somewhat of a sticking plaster solution, both to cover the immediate COVID costs that pharmacists have incurred, but also to make up for the longer-term shortfall. My fear is, if pharmacists are left holding the bag for the costs that they've incurred through serving their community in the past few months, many of them, including Tim, are worried that they will be forced to shut down in the next year or two. And I believe that would be a national shame. This ongoing uncertainty is an additional burden that pharmacists just don't need. And again, all pharmacists are valuable and all of them play an important role. But independent pharmacists, because they are more embedded in their community and very often are seen as a friendly, valued and above all trusted voice, they take pressure off the NHS, off A&E, and they take pressure off GPs' surgeries. Now, on the island, we are sitting roughly on average for the number of GPs. But as the Minister well knows, that we are struggling somewhat to make sure that there is an adequate supply of GPs so that we can supply the primary care that this country needs. I know the Minister is a friend to pharmacists. Can she say something that will reassure pharmacists, and especially the independent pharmacists, that this government understands not only their value but somewhat unique role over and above chains of pharmacists? And can she say something that could reassure the independent pharmacists in my constituency, and I'm sure many others, over their value, but also how the government is wishing to support them? Happy good way.
Really grateful to the honourable member. He's making a powerful speech, and can I congratulate him on securing this adjournment debate. Having worked in an independent pharmacy whilst I was still at school, I very much recognise that trusted relationship that he's talking about between the pharmacist and the community that they serve. When the funding formula for pharmacies changed in 2016, the then Minister told the APPG for pharmacies they expected between 1,000 and 3,000 pharmacies to close, as they would no longer be financially viable in the face of the cuts. So it was already a tough, bleak financial outlook for pharmacies. And of those pharmacies that we have seen close, a significant number of them have been independent pharmacies. Would you agree that that's a real shame and a real loss to those communities?
I thank the honourable member for the point she's making. I was actually just about to come on and quote the statistics myself, but thank you very much for teeing up the next bit of what I'd like to say, Mr Deputy Speaker. Looking at the facts and figures, as I understand it, the budget for community pharmacies is £2.6 billion. A significant amount of money, but quite a small proportion of the NHS's total budget, which stretches to cover some 11,500 community pharmacies, serving the majority population of the United Kingdom, about 56 million people. On average, each one serves about 5,000 people per month and dispenses 7,300 prescriptions. In the last 4 years, as the honourable member says, the last 4 years, the funding for pharmacies has shrunk by a significant amount, and quoted figures of approximately 200 million. And Tim and other pharmacies in my patch are concerned that now there is going to be significant additional pressure, and as we've heard, we've seen statistics to suggest after 3,000 pharmacies could close for good. This hasn't happened yet. These are threats. Some have, but the majority is still struggling on. I believe this would be short-sighted in the extreme. A sustainable pharmacy sector, I'm sure the Minister would agree, Mr Deputy Speaker, is a critical part of the NHS network in this country, because it takes pressure, as I've said, off both A&E and GPs, and we badly need it. And actually, having used an independent community pharmacy myself, you know the value added of having somebody trusted to talk to you, whether it's a bunged up ear because I swim too much, well not at the moment, which I have, or more serious concerns. NHS pharmacies are really willing to support the Trace and Test programme, something that I have knowledge of in my patch due to our experience trialling the app, which sadly wasn't taken further. But they could also help to ensure support for the Trace and Test, support for home testing kits, and support for certainly the winter vaccination programme, which is likely to be of increased significance this year because of the potential phase 2 of COVID, which clearly we all hope is not going to happen. There is strong public support, Mr Deputy Speaker, for community pharmacies. In a recent opinion poll, 81% hold a favourable view of pharmacies, 78% value a face-to-face relationship. I wish members of this House had those sorts of approval ratings. We live in hope. More than half want to see emergency COVID funding turned into a permanent grant, versus a significantly small amount who want to see it repaid. Crucially, the public are ahead of the health bureaucracy in seeing the benefit of having this network of highly trained healthcare professionals in many communities in Britain. And 84% say the NHS should do more to make use of pharmacist skills. It does seem to be a bit of a wasted resource when you have people who have so much skill and so much ability in dispensing medicine and actually being that first sort of point of call for many people who are feeling under the weather. 71% think pharmacies should be able to expand their offering to take pressure on the NHS, something I completely agree with, and I'm wondering how we can do that and how we can work towards that betterment, which is certainly in all of our interests, considering the relatively small amounts of money compared to the overall NHS budget, which go towards pharmacies and specifically community pharmacies. So I will round up here to let maybe other members speak, but if I could just tempt the Minister to talk to how she can support community pharmacies, the 6 in my patch, but also the 11,500 across Britain. what she can say to reassure us that the financial support will be there, because losing independent pharmacies, I think, will be much more expensive in the long run than shoring modest additional sums to make sure that we help keep their pharmacy businesses viable, especially during the COVID period, when other elements of their business, the cash and the trade of the chemist has clearly been declining. And I will leave it there, but I look very much forward to the Minister's response. Thank you, Mr.